My name's Sandra Lean, and I've just written a new book called Innocence Betrayed, which tells the story of the murder of 14-year-old Jodi Jones back in 2003 in Middleday in Scotland, and the conviction of her then 14-year-old boyfriend, Luke Mitchell, for that murder. Luke was sentenced to be detained without limit of time, with a minimum sentence of 20 years, for what I believe is a crime he didn't commit. I needed to know more. I needed to know that, first of all, I needed to know that they were going after the right guy, and ultimately that they got the right guy. Because I wanted to know that my girls were safe. It's really difficult in Scotland to investigate a case like this to any sort of degree, because legal teams are not allowed to disclose or to share case papers with third parties. I was very fortunate. In 2009 I was given access to the defence papers in this case, and pretty much everything that the defence had I've now seen. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documents, statements, crime scene photographs, legal documents, everything that the defence had access to I've seen. I've also had the opportunity to interview witnesses who weren't interviewed by the police, although you would have expected they should have been. And obviously I've had access both to Luke and to his family, in a way that I could speak with them rather than speaking about them, which is what the media did for all that time. So probably the only person in Scotland who has seen absolutely everything there is to see connected with the case so far. So Jodi and Luke were supposed to meet up that night after tea at the end of Luke Street, so somewhere between 5:30 and 6 o'clock, but Jodi never showed. When she was found, maybe 6 hours later, the injuries to her body were horrific. It was a dreadful attack. She'd been beaten, she'd been strangled, she'd suffered a vicious knife attack. Her throat had been cut between 12 and 20 times. She'd then been stripped, her clothing cut off, and her body mutilated after she was killed. The impact, not just on the local area, but on the whole country, was massive. It was such a quiet, safe, sleepy little area that for something so horrifying to happen on the doorstep, obviously massive shock in the local area, but the story was on the front page of every newspaper for days and weeks. It was on all the national TV, all the news broadcasts. We had cameramen, photographers, reporters in the villages, not the village itself and the small adjoining villages. The story, it was massive, and it was relentlessly massive. The whole point to all of it, it was Luke. It was Luke. That is how we treated a 14-year-old kid. All of this media attention, really countrywide and further, it was him, it was him, it was him. Before a single piece of evidence had been gathered. it was a case that was covered in the most lurid, sensationalist fashion. So, for example, there was this supposed Marilyn Manson influence, the shock rocker, who Luke was apparently obsessed by, and he'd copied the Black Dahlia murder in the United States in the 1940s, because Marilyn Manson had put water paintings of that murder on his website, and Luke, it was claimed, carried these images in his mind and carried out a copycat murder. Slight difficulty with that is that the pathology reports, the expert reports, all said whatever similarities there were between the two murders were superficial, is the first thing. Second is there is no evidence anywhere, there never was any evidence anywhere, that Luke had ever seen any information about the Black Dahlia murder, far less these watercolours on the Marilyn Manson website. But the proof, the so-called proof of his obsession, Luke's obsession with Marilyn Manson, was one CD that he got after Jodi was murdered. And there's this sort of belief that he bought it. He didn't. He bought a music magazine, and the CD was a freebie, a promo freebie with the music magazine. He did have a calendar that his dad's partner had bought for him, and he was not best impressed with it, so he ripped it up and chucked it in the bin. There is your evidence of Luke Mitchell's obsession with Marilyn Manson. There were three main planks to the prosecution case against Luke. The first one, the one that everybody knew about, was a suggestion that Luke knew where the body was and that he'd led the other three members of the search party to the body. Luke's story was always that his dog, which was trained to be a tracker dog, had alerted him to a point in the wall, just past a V break in the wall, and he doubled back, climbed over the wall and turned in the direction that the dog had alerted, and that's where he found Jodi's body. The prosecution were having none of it. According to the other witnesses, the dog did nothing. Luke went straight through the V-point with no apparent reason for doing so, and, had no emotional reaction, nothing. He just found the body and that was it. But I've seen the original statements, where the other members of the search party told exactly the same story as Luke in the early stages. For the first month, they were telling exactly the same story as Luke, that the dog was jumping about at the wall, that the dog stood up and scrabbled against the wall, that he'd had to double back to get through this V-break in the wall. So those statements all supported what Luke was saying. And then at the end of July, the statements changed. I've seen the two versions, I've seen both versions, and the statements changed. The question's got to be why. Why did they change their story to say the dog did nothing? It can only be that those statements were needed to support the suggestion that Luke knew where the body was. And yet, the first month, everybody said it was the dog that alerted him. So that's one major issue straight away, that those documents were never before the jury. But they're in the defence files. The second plank of the prosecution case was that an eyewitness had seen a couple at the East House's end of the path that were claimed to be Luke and Jodi. And this was about 10 to 5, so this fits with the time of death of 5:15, where this eventually became the absolute time that Jodi was murdered, at 5:15. It also happens to be the only time that they could accuse Luke of being the killer, because he'd alibied for any time after that. So if Jodi wasn't murdered at 5:15, the murderer wasn't Luke. But that's aside. This eyewitness claimed not to know Jodi or Luke or any of their family members, completely independent, and she'd made this sighting when she was driving past in the car on a really sharp bend with two little kids in the back. She described a male, late teens to early 20s, with thick, shaggy, very thick, shaggy hair sticking up in a clump at the back. Luke was a skinny 14-year-old kid with poker straight blonde hair. The girl she described as wearing a blue hoodie and lighter blue bootcut jeans. Jodi was wearing black, baggy trousers, a really baggy hoodie with a bright orange Deftones logo across the back, which this witness didn't see, couldn't explain how she didn't see it and how the colour of the hoodie changed from blue to black. So essentially, the obvious thing here is that the people she saw weren't Luke and Jodi. The descriptions are completely different. But she also said she saw no facial features on either of them, so she couldn't identify them other than by clothes. 6 weeks later, the police take a Polaroid picture of Luke and show her it and say, "Is this the guy?" And she goes, "Yeah, that's him." She said she didn't see any facial features, but from this Polaroid, she identifies Luke, or she says that's him. But it would have been 2009, so 6 years after the murder, when I managed to get a look at the first look at the defence documents. This lady's brother-in-law is in Jodi's granny's house with members of her family the morning after Jodi was found. So Jodi was found at about 20 to midnight on the night of June 30th. And on the morning of July 1st, this guy's in the Grand's house telling her whole family about the sighting that his sister-in-law had made. He then goes from there to the sister-in-law's house and is there when she gives her first statement to the police. For the next 4 days, he's going back and forward between Jodi's family and this witness. It was never investigated, it was never brought out at trial. She was supposed to be completely independent, she didn't know either of them. We'll never know now how much influence the brother-in-law, being so close to Jodi's family, might have had on her recollection, on her identification. She was not supposed to know what either of them looked like. And yet 6 weeks later, she's shown a photograph of Luke and she said, "That's the guy I saw." The third plank of the case was that Luke had no alibi for the time of the murder. He had no alibi for the time of the murder if the murder was at 5:15, which there's no evidence to prove one way or the other. His alibi was his mother and his brother. He was at home cooking dinner. He called his mum at work to ask what he was to cook for dinner, and that call's on the landline logs. So somebody had to be in his house making a call from the landline, and since his mum and his brother were at work, and there's only the three of them that live in the house, who else could have made that call? That's the first thing. His brother called to see what time he was coming in for tea as well, which is another link to somebody being in the house. The police refused to accept his mother and his brother's accounts of that evening. They said they were making it up to cover for Luke not being there, even though there's nothing to suggest he wasn't there. So it's not that he didn't have an alibi, it's that they didn't accept the evidence of his mother and his brother that gave him an alibi. There are other people in this case, closer to Jodi even, who have no alibi for the claimed time of the murder, but they were never suspects. All of it goes back to, they focused on Luke from the off, right from the beginning, and they simply didn't look at anybody else. And when you look at the documents and you see how many other possible routes of inquiry there were that were never investigated, they never looked at them. They just didn't look at them. It's unbelievable, really. There was a little knife pouch The image of this knife pouch was widely circulated, the implication being that it had housed the murder weapon, which had never been found. Actually, the knife pouch was about that size, so no chance that it could have held the murder weapon. But the big deal about this that the media made was that Luke had written on this knife pouch, the finest day I ever had was when tomorrow never came. It was actually Jodi's favourite quote from a Nirvana song. It could be said, at the worst I suppose, it was inappropriate to carve it on a knife pouch, or to write it on a knife pouch. That was another misconception, that it was carved. It was actually written in Bible on a leather knife pouch. But that's inappropriate is as far as you can go with it. There's nothing more sinister than that. There was lots of DNA found at the murder scene on Jodi's body, on her clothing, and in the area around about where the body was found. None of it was Luke Mitchell's. There was none of Jodi's DNA ever found in any of Luke's clothing, in his house, his mum's car, anywhere. Nothing of him at the scene at all. There have been suggestions, some people have suggested that somehow he was forensically aware and he cleaned the DNA away. How then do we explain the DNA of other males on the body, on the clothing, and in the area, the woodland area? How could Luke have cleaned away his own DNA and left the DNA of other males? It's not possible. But how could a 14-year-old have committed such a horrific crime, and the amount of contact there had to have been between the murderer and Jodi, and not have deposited a single skin cell, a single piece of DNA anywhere? That is not possible. That is not possible. Jodi put up a huge fight. The pathologist said she fought to the end. None of Luke's DNA there. It makes no sense. Because the police were building this narrative of a boy completely out of control and indulged by his mother, they came up with this story that a parka jacket that Luke had been wearing when he committed the murder, he'd somehow managed to get back to his mum, who then burned it in a log burner in the back garden. And this was to explain why there was no forensic evidence of the murder on Luke at all. He'd been wearing this parka jacket, and it gathered up all the forensic evidence, and then his mum burned it in the log burner. There was no evidence ever that anything had been burned, any clothing had been burned in the log burner. The ashes were forensically tested, the brickwork was all forensically tested, the bottom grate was all forensically tested. Nothing to say that there had been any item of clothing burned there at all. But when it was floated in court, it wasn't presented as evidence as such. It was merely a suggestion that this may have happened. Most of us expect by the time it gets to court there has to be some evidence to back it up, but there was nothing. The one thing I would say to people is think again. I understand that you might have your doubts, you might be sceptical, but take another look. Take another look at the information that's there. Take another look at the information that's never been in the public domain. Because Jodi hasn't had justice. Her family hasn't had justice. Luke and his family haven't had justice, and really that means none of us has had justice.